Welcome to the first of this series of lectures this year about atrocities and memory. What I want to do with you this evening falls into two parts. I will, of course, as my title promises, be talking about some of the atrocities associated with Spain during the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries in particular, those around the notorious Spanish Inquisition. But before I come to that, for the first part of this lecture, I want to talk about the wider subject to frame the whole series for the year. Why do I want to spend 6 hours up here over the course of this year talking about atrocities? What do I mean by atrocities anyway? And given that my title is Professor of Divinity, what on earth has that got to do with my subject? So let's be clear what I mean by an atrocity. It's not just an act of violence. Acts of violence are an entirely normal and everyday part of human history. I'm afraid that living as we do in an unusually peaceful society and age, we can sometimes forget this basic fact. But most acts of violence are not atrocities in the sense that I mean. They're crimes, or acts of self-defense, or acts of war, or acts of criminal justice. In other words, most acts of violence are seen either as lawful or legitimate or acceptable in some way, given their context, or at least, as in the case of most criminal violence, they're seen as normal, an all too common fact of life. They may be terrible, but they're not surprising. Maybe surprising or shocking if it happens to you or someone close to you, but it's not surprising that such things happen. An atrocity is a violent act or series of acts that goes beyond what's normal, what's expected, something which is shocking, something which is eye-catching, a crime that's beyond normal criminality, and which stands out, whether because of its unusual cruelty or scale, or the especial innocence of its victims, or the especial depravity of its perpetrators. For example, the murder of young children. And even then, there have been hundreds of children murdered in this country over the past few decades. Only a handful of those deaths have become atrocities. Or an atrocity may be an act of war that goes beyond the laws and the norms of war, like a massacre of civilians or of prisoners, or maybe acts like indiscriminate bombing carried out without regard for civilian casualties. Even judicial violence can become an atrocity if it violates normal expectations, if there are summary procedures, dubious evidence, draconian punishments, something like the French Revolution's reign of terror or the Stalinist purges. And as all those possibilities make clear, there's one other ingredient necessary for a violent event to be an atrocity, in the sense that I mean, which is that somebody's got to notice it. An atrocity is in the eye of the beholder. A dreadful crime that's successfully concealed can't be an atrocity. And of course, the perpetrators of such crimes often do try to conceal them. Think of the hidden mass graves of the Yugoslavian wars, or of the Polish soldiers massacred at Katyn in 1940. For as long as they remain successfully concealed, decades in this case, these events are not atrocities. And the same is true of atrocities which are hiding in plain sight, which might not be actively concealed, but for the time being are not noticed. The genocide of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, for example, attracted remarkably little attention when Hitler made his infamous comment in August 1939, who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians. He wasn't wrong. But nowadays, the Armenian genocide's been recovered for historical memory and is a subject of live controversy, as anyone who is rash enough to raise the subject with the Turkish authorities knows. It's become an atrocity. You could say the same about a rather different kind of atrocity, the transatlantic slave trade. This was a centuries-long act of systemic violence. As Rousseau suggested, it was a kind of war waged against the people who were enslaved. And for 2 centuries or more, few Europeans noticed that this was happening. Of course, they knew that the slave trade existed, but they didn't attend to it as an act of violence. And those who did tended to think of it as normal, maybe regrettable, but not an atrocity, not an exceptional event which demanded an exceptional response. And the rise of abolitionism from the late 18th century came about in large part because of a shift of perception amongst certain sections of the primarily British and American publics, during which they came to see the slave trade as an atrocity, an exceptional event. And this shift was helped by stories and depictions of certain extreme acts of abuse, like this famous image of the packed slave ship, or the notorious episode from 1781 of the slave ship the Zong, whose crew deliberately drowned 131 men and women from their cargo hold in order to claim their value from their insurers. Atrocity stories like this help to awaken the wider public to the fact that a vast atrocity had been continuing under their noses for centuries. And that sort of sudden moral shock that you have been complicit in something, an evil of that scale, is comparable to the way that modern anti-abortion campaigners or vegans will awake to what they see as huge, ongoing, unnoticed atrocities in which their whole society is quietly complicit. If some events are concealed or ignored and don't become atrocities till they begin to attract attention and to shock, others are carried out in a deliberate attempt to shock and to seek attention. That's their purpose. An act of terrorism is an atrocity almost by definition. It's an act of violence perpetrated deliberately to shock and to attract attention. The suffering of the victims is almost a byproduct. Those of you who remember the terrorist attacks in the United States on the 11th of September 2001 will remember that there was a great deal of confusion in the days immediately following about the actual death toll. We now know that a little less than 3,000 people were killed that day, which is, of course, a very large number. But it was some months before that figure was finally established. In the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Twin Towers, much higher figures were being aired. Sober and level-headed estimates were suggesting at least 10,000 dead. Figures as high as 19,000 were being guessed at. And these estimates, thankfully, turned out to be greatly exaggerated, but they weren't stupid based on the information available at the moment. And in some ways, that immediate guess of 10,000 deaths mattered more than the eventual reality, because it was that that determined the response. A terrorist atrocity is about shock and about attention. It's an act of performance, almost of theatre, a fact which these attackers fully understood, because it was the initial shock, not the eventual facts, that determined the political, cultural, military response. Or to put it another way, what happened to the Twin Towers was an act of violence. It was what happened on TV that made it into an atrocity. Which, of course, raises an obvious possibility. If an atrocity is in the eye of the beholder and is chiefly about shock or attention, it need not actually have any real victims at all. Even if the event isn't wholly invented, it can certainly be wildly distorted. The notion of the false or exaggerated atrocity as an act of propaganda is, of course, all too familiar. The atrocity stories associated with the German occupation of Belgium during the First World War are some of the most famous. And there were indeed some genuine horrors, but the way in which Allied propaganda settled on and used these stories to build support for the war, especially but not only in Britain, didn't owe a great deal to sober and balanced reporting. And since, of course, the possibility of exaggerated and invented atrocities is so well known, there's an obvious counterploy, which is the attempt by contemporary or later defenders of the supposedly guilty party to downplay or deny that an atrocity's taken place. Witness the Turkish state's ongoing resistance to the use of the word genocide to describe the killing of Armenians during the First World War. Or, of course, the now all too well-documented phenomenon of Holocaust denial. Or take the massacre of Nanjing, which followed the occupation of the former Chinese capital by Imperial Japanese forces in December 1937. The Japanese records of this event were deliberately destroyed near the end of the war, and the episode remains an unresolved conflict between Chinese and Japanese accounts. The numbers involved are contested. The figures that are seriously advanced for the number of dead range from 50,000 to 300,000. Most scholars outside Japan converge near the top end of that range. But as you'll realize by now, the numbers are in large part symbolic. They represent a wider disagreement about whether this was an ordinary military occupation accompanied by some regrettable abuses by a few bad apples, and therefore not an atrocity, just normal war, or whether it was an event which can stand for the whole horror of the Japanese war in China, and therefore make that entire struggle one giant atrocity. And as that controversy, which is very much still live, makes plain, an atrocity exists not so much in the eye of the beholder as in the memory. It's about which acts of violence we choose to cherish and to remember, and which ones we choose to forget. I should say that in talking about atrocities like this, I'm absolutely not trying to reduce terrible events to a kind of relativistic, both-sides-ish mush in which everything is a hall of mirrors and no one's ever truly guilty of anything. Many, maybe most atrocities are real, although I worry more about our tendency to turn a blind eye to perhaps much more terrible events that it doesn't suit our immediate purpose to notice. My concern is with the fog of political preferences that stops us seeing these events clearly and that leads us to focus on the things we want to see and not on the things that we don't. For example, in 1756, the Nawab of Bengal laid siege to the British East India Company's fort in Calcutta, reduced it, and took the surviving British defenders prisoner. And they were imprisoned overnight in a tiny dungeon in the fort. Somewhere between 64 and 146 men were held in a space intended for 2 or 3 prisoners. Our accounts claim that all but 23 of those imprisoned in this space died. This event in the so-called Black Hole of Calcutta became an atrocity in my full sense of the word. Once the story reached Britain, it was told and retold, and it became part of the justification for Robert Clive's subsequent campaign against and conquest of Bengal. A tablet was erected to the victims. A further monument was erected in 1901, nearly 150 years later. Following protests by Indian nationalists, it was moved to its current site in an Anglican churchyard in 1940. Naturally, the inscription on the monument gives the maximalist estimate of the casualties. And meanwhile, the phrase, the Black Hole of Calcutta, became a proverb, and is, at least according to some accounts, the source of the astronomical term, black hole, which is not just a zippier phrase than the previous term, a gravitationally collapsed object, but it's also an allusion to a phenomenon that you can be packed into almost ad infinitum, but with no hope of ever coming out again. And against this backdrop, Clive's conquest of Bengal was followed by the doubling of agricultural taxes and a further 10 percentage point hike in 1770, which turned what would otherwise have been a problematic drought into a full-scale famine in which something in the order of 10 million people died in Bengal. As you will appreciate, that story too is hotly disputed. But even those who try to defend the East India's role in exacerbating the famine don't attempt to argue that it made any real moves to relieve it. And while there were a series of such catastrophic famines in various parts of India under British rule, there have been none in India since independence. Now, my point is not to play the atrocity counters game of parlaying numbers of deaths into an argument over moral superiority, but to observe that for the British, during the Raj, the dozens of deaths in the Black Hole were an outrageous atrocity, whereas the millions of deaths in the famine were a regrettable tragedy. Whereas, of course, for anti-colonial and nationalist historians since then, the Black Hole was an exaggerated myth, and the famine was an atrocity perpetuated by callous neglect and exacerbated by centuries of deliberate suppression. And that brings me to the last distinguishing feature of an atrocity. I said it's a shocking event, and so it is. Certain atrocities can leave onlookers thunderstruck and turn their worlds upside down. The effect of the 11th September 2001 attacks on both wider population and especially political leadership in Britain and the United States and elsewhere was, it seems to me, genuinely transformative. This was a watershed moment. But in another sense, and this especially applies to how atrocities are remembered and their stories burnished, atrocities aren't shocking. They're comforting. They're the events that we want to remember. Because the thing about an atrocity is it always has a villain. A catastrophic event like the sinking of the Titanic or the destruction of Pantglas Junior School in Aberfan in 1966, these are not atrocities, or at least not in most people's eyes. We might blame certain individuals or institutions for the parts they played, but they're not what the story is about. An atrocity story is primarily about the wickedness of the perpetrators. And you tell those stories to keep alive the memory of what they did, to stir up those who hear you for the ongoing struggle against them, to warn the next generation of the supposedly similar threats or villains that might still rear their heads. When you hear an atrocity story told, a story told to shock and to horrify, the question to ask is, of course, who wants me to be shocked and horrified by this and why? Is it the perpetrator? Is it somebody who wants to stir up opposition to the perpetrator? Or is it somebody who's trying to use my shock and horror to sell me a newspaper or make me click on a link? A phenomenon which, of course, goes back to at least to the invention of popular print in the 16th century. If an atrocity story no longer has an edge, if it's not capable of stirring people to anger or righteous indignation or fear, then it's no longer an atrocity, it's just a story. The mere passage of time can do it. Even in my home in the northeast of England, the Viking raids of the 9th century don't get people very excited anymore. Visiting Norwegians don't need to be embarrassed. The Visigothic and Vandal sackings of Rome in the 5th century, these were atrocities that once paralyzed the civilized world with fear. They don't have much potency anymore, in part because there are no longer people whom we can identify as Visigoths or Vandals. And politics can speed the process up. I vividly recall visiting the monument to George Washington in Washington, D.C., and receiving a little very gentle and good-natured teasing from a park ranger about atrocities committed by the British during the American Revolution. It was only 2.5 centuries ago, which in atrocity time is yesterday. But remembering British atrocities no longer serves any political purpose in the United States, and so they can be laughed about. Still, they're there. They could probably be warmed up again if the need ever arose. As anyone from the Balkans could tell you, memories can be kept discreetly in a freezer for a very long time and reheated very fast. And that brings me at last to the theme of religion. Most of the examples of atrocities I've mentioned so far have been nationalistic or ideological. Stories about the wickedness of the Croats or the British or the Chinese, or about the wickedness of communists or fascists or imperialists. So it'd be no surprise to find that religion, that other great marker of identity, is in the mix too. But it's more than just another one. Religion, after all, deals in the currency of absolutes, and absolutes lend themselves to violence. Even nationalism's demands are usually limited to some extent, the dispute over a particular piece of territory, say. religion's demands can be unlimited. It's about eternity, about absolute values, and ends like that can be used to justify virtually any means. They're worth dying for, and therefore potentially worth killing for. That may mean, it's often been argued, that religions therefore incline towards atrocities. Although, since religions also contain significant forces of moral self-restraint, I think it's hard to see which side of the ledger that actually falls on. But I think what is clear is that religions are particularly quick to detect and denounce atrocities in others. After all, religions deal in ethics, and an atrocity is nothing if it's not an ethical category. A nationalist or a secular ideologue may be able to shrug off an atrocity allegation as irrelevant. The claim that Stalin said that 1 million deaths is a mere statistic is probably false. But that kind of utilitarian approach to human suffering was certainly consistent with communist ideology. Most religious ethical systems would find it very difficult. And this is particularly so because religions often use ethics to diagnose truth. A false religion shows itself to be false, so the theory goes, by the immoral conduct of its followers. And so a religious atrocity isn't just shocking, it's also revealing. And of course we see this in our own time. Terrorist acts committed by jihadist Islamists are quite deliberately and self-consciously religious atrocities, aiming not only to kill those who are deemed to deserve it, that's almost a side effect, but to grab the world's attention and to do what violence of almost any kind always does, to polarize, to drive people to one extreme or the other, especially by the means of provoking reactions. These atrocities are designed to reduce the choices available down to jihadist violence on one side and anti-Islamic violence on the other. Of course, in the hope that the world's billions of non-jihadist Muslims will be forced to embrace the cause. It's not a stupid strategy, although happily it's a long way from succeeding. And other religious traditions are in on the act too, whether that be Buddhists using stories of Muslim atrocities to justify atrocities of their own, which we're seeing in Myanmar or Sri Lanka, or attempts by both religious sides in Northern Ireland to use events like the Omagh bombing or Bloody Sunday to claim the moral high ground. If the shootings in Derry on the 30th of January 1972 had happened on a different day of the week, I don't think we would remember it as Bloody Wednesday. But I fear that we're unlikely to learn very much from talking about our contemporary atrocities. We've all got our views as to which ones matter and which don't, which ones reveal the true horror of a particular nation or party or religion, and which ones are unfortunate aberrations or irresponsible exaggerations. What I want to do in this series of lectures is to think about the business of atrocity making and how atrocities are used and abused. And for that purpose, we need to step back to an earlier age. We're not going to go back to the Vikings, the Visigoths, and the Vandals, but to something a bit nearer, the so-called early modern age, the 16th, the 17th centuries, which by no coincidence was the first heyday of popular print, and was a great age of the religious atrocity, real, exaggerated, and imagined. We may feel that most of the battles that these atrocities were used to fight are over and done. But one of the things I want to suggest in my lectures is that they linger on and they underpin prejudices and presumptions and fears that are still with us. But I also want to use them to look at this whole phenomenon at one remove, so we can see how the business works when we're not quite so directly involved in it. For one thing, it's useful to look at an era of religious atrocities in which most, although not all, of the perpetrators were self-proclaimed Christians. I hope I don't need to say this, I suppose I should. Not that I'm trying to say that Christian atrocities then are as bad as or morally equivalent to atrocities committed by other religions now. This is not a competition. Though I suppose it is worth challenging the widespread assumption in our own times that Islam is a uniquely violent religion. But over the next 6 lectures, we'll be looking at a series of atrocity stories from this period. And in each of these, I want to do 2 things. First of all, to try to lay out reasonably clearly, as matter-of-factly as I can, what actually happened insofar as modern scholarship has been able to reconstruct it. And then I want to look at how the events have been remembered, retold, used, or forgotten in their own times and since. So next time we'll be looking at the burnings of Protestants in England under the Tudors and what came of it. In future lectures we'll go on to look at the notorious St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, at the terrible persecution of Catholics in Japan in the 1610s and thereafter, at the competing narratives of massacre which came to define 17th century Ireland. I did say that some of these stories still linger on. And then in the final lecture to look at our modern memories of this era's atrocities, the ones we remember, the ones we exaggerate, and the ones we forget. But we have to begin with the country whose name became a simple byword for cruelty in the early modern age, with Spain. What gives this story additional pathos, at least in modern times, is the background. In the early 8th century, the Iberian Peninsula was conquered by the Umayyad Caliphate and fell under Muslim rule. And from the 9th century onwards, the various Christian territories which had hung on, to begin with, only at the very northern edge of the peninsula, began to push back. And from then until 1492, the region was divided between Christian and Muslim rule. And it also had a significant Jewish population, making the peninsula by far the most religiously diverse region of Europe. Its modern reputation for tolerance and peaceful coexistence during the Middle Ages includes a good deal of romantic exaggeration, but it's not made up. This period of coexistence, or convivencia, was never very much approved of by any of the religious authorities. And it was brought to a fairly abrupt end in the late 15th century, when quite suddenly Iberia went from being an embattled frontier region of Christendom to being the home of its superpower. This began with a marriage. In 1469, Isabella, the heiress to the Kingdom of Castile, the biggest kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula, married Ferdinand, the Crown Prince of Aragon. And in this way, 2 of the 3 primary Christian kingdoms on the peninsula were united, as it turned out, permanently. And the united entity came to be called Spain. The 3rd kingdom, Portugal, proved tougher to swallow, though not for want of trying. When they inherited their respective crowns, these 2 turned out to be a formidable team, dedicated to the creation of a new, fully Catholic Spain. Pope Alexander VI, an ally to whom they owed a good deal, gave them the formal title of the Catholic monarchs in 1494, and they passed that on to their successors. But the really important development had already happened in 1478. Ferdinand and Isabella found themselves ruling territories with substantial Jewish and, to a lesser extent, Muslim populations. And for the century or more before, especially following a wave of anti-Semitic rioting in 1391, the principal means of dealing with this Jewish problem, as they saw it, was to encourage Jews to convert to Christianity, by persuasion if possible, and increasingly by force if necessary. Now, strictly speaking, forced conversions are invalid, but quite what constitutes force and quite what constitutes firm encouragement was open to debate. And the result was that by Ferdinand and Isabella's time, there was a population numbering over 200,000 of so-called conversos, that is, baptized Christians who were themselves or who were descended from converts from Judaism, and whose conversions were widely held by the rest of the Christian population to be suspect. This division between, as they were called, old and new Christians would poison Spanish life for centuries. And incidentally, it would help to give rise to modern anti-Semitism, in which Jewishness is defined racially as opposed to old-fashioned anti-Judaism, in which it was defined by religious affiliation and practice. Anyway, in 15th century Spain, these conversos were widely, and often correctly, suspected of being crypto-Jewish, of continuing to practice Judaism in various ways, to various extents, despite formally professing Christianity. And since they were baptized Christians, Judaizing of this kind was formally classed as a heresy. And if you're a monarch keen to stamp out heresy, you've got an obvious tool to hand. Since the late 12th century, the Church had created a kind of tribunal known as the Inquisition, empowered to investigate, try, and punish suspected heretics. The Inquisition had a presence in Aragon, particularly for a long time, but kings suspicious of its independent powers had marginalized it. The kings of Castile had prevented the Inquisition ever being established there at all. So the system was not working the way that it should, and the problem was getting worse. In 1467, 2 conversos in Llerena, in southwestern Castile, were discovered to be practicing Judaism and were promptly burned as heretics. In 1475, a terrible tale circulated of a Christian child who was kidnapped and crucified on Palm Sunday by Jews. This is a version of one of the most perennial atrocity stories of all. Whether these and other similar incidents actually pushed Ferdinand and Isabella into action or merely provided them with a pretext. In 1478, they extracted a remarkable bull from Pope Sixtus IV. A new inquisitorial tribunal for their 2 kingdoms would be created, and its staff would be appointed not by the popes or by bishops, but by the monarchs themselves. In an age when the power of the papacy was on the wane, an exceptionally important papal power had been delegated to or seized by the monarchs of a rising Catholic power. Successive popes would try to recover control over the Spanish Inquisition that Sixtus IV created, but without success. It began slowly. The first inquisitors weren't appointed until 1480. To begin with, the effects were almost entirely confined to one region, the areas near Seville and Cordoba. The first trials took place in Seville in February 1481. 6 conversos were burned for Judaizing. But now the matter began to snowball. Conversos, alarmed by the tribunal, began to move to apparently safer parts of the country, and so the Inquisition began to bulk up its staff to keep track of them. 7 new inquisitors were appointed in 1482. New tribunals were established around Spain. By 1492, there were 8 of them, and the executions gathered pace as well. One day in February 1484, 34 conversos were burned together in Ciudad Real. Stories emerged from Seville and then from Toledo of conspiracies by leading conversos to murder inquisitors and other leading churchmen, and each such story led to a wave of arrests and executions. And in 1485, one inquisitor was actually murdered, apparently by thugs hired by local conversos while he was at prayer before the high altar in Saragossa Cathedral. Of course, the murderers themselves were executed, but that was only the start. The crisis was used to break the city's leading converso families over the following decade, and it was wheeled out again and again to silence any murmurs of disquiet about the Inquisition for a century or more. It is even possible that the whole business was deliberately staged, although there's no evidence for that. In 1488, a new body, the Suprema, was created to oversee all of these different inquisitorial tribunals, and its head took on the new title of Inquisitor General. The first holder of that office was a Dominican friar, Tomás de Torquemada. It's not easy to establish the scale of the Inquisition's killings. We don't have very much documentation from the earliest years. The best modern historians' guesses, and they're not much more than guesses, tend to arrive at figures of between 1,000 and 2,000 executions during the period up to 1530, after which it drops off. For comparison, the total number of people executed in the United States since the restoration of the death penalty there in 1977 is 1,503. So the Spanish Inquisition amassed a pretty hefty body count, but it wasn't a genocidal tribunal. Only a small number of the cases that it heard ended in an execution. That's partly because there were a lot of trials and condemnations in absentia, because conversos fled before they were arrested. And there were also a fair number of posthumous condemnations, which was a good way of seizing someone's property. But most of all, the thing that kept the execution rate down was a key inquisitorial method known by the Orwellian name of the Edict of Grace. This was a declaration by an inquisitorial tribunal of a period of time during which heretics were invited to come forward and confess their errors voluntarily. Those who did so could expect relatively gentle discipline. But anyone who did not come forward and was then arrested was liable to execution as an impenitent heretic. Naturally, these windows of opportunity produced surges of preventative confessions, many of them from conversos whose Christianity seems to have been real enough, but who merely continued to avoid pork or observe some other residual Jewish-tinged custom. But if you wanted to take advantage of the Edict of Grace, you were required to demonstrate your sincerity. And the most standard means of doing that was to denounce other people who were guilty of the same offense. This is one sign that the Inquisition was rather an unusual court. It's one of the main things that recommended it to monarchs, and one of the reasons why formal inquisitions were contentious wherever they were mooted. They cut across existing legal processes as if they weren't there. Those arrested by the Inquisition were legally presumed guilty. Acquittals did happen, especially in the early years, but the Spanish Inquisition particularly worked on the principle that they should be avoided unless absolutely necessary, because they tended to undermine the tribunal's reputation. All proceedings were in secret, as indeed were the tribunal's own rules and processes. Suspects were generally not informed of the charges against them until the last possible moment. They were merely asked to confess to whatever they might know themselves to be guilty of. They were never told the names of witnesses or the details of charges against them. Prisoners were kept incommunicado as far as possible. They might have a lawyer appointed for them by the tribunal, but the lawyer's duty was not to defend them, but to persuade them to confess. Naturally, all this abandonment of legal norms alarmed some people and gratified others. For Ferdinand and Isabella and for their successors, a freelance tribunal under their direct control, which could help knit together their two kingdoms, was rather welcome. And the fact that the Inquisition treated all suspects alike, regardless of wealth or social status, or even rank within the church, was much appreciated by monarchs who sometimes struggled to cut their overmighty subjects down to size. And of course, the fact that heretics' property was forfeit to the crown was a lucrative side benefit. So this is a very effective way of rolling up dissident networks. But it has a side effect. It produced what statisticians would call false positives. A conscientious inquisitor, besieged by anxious conversos, eager to confess while they still could, would likely find himself appalled. He knew that Spain's Jewish problem was bad, but it seems to have been much, much worse than he could imagine. And as the inquisitors and the monarchs mulled this problem as the thing snowballed during the 1480s, one consistent theme began to emerge. How could conversos be expected to resist the insidious temptation to revert to Judaism as long as actual unrepentant Jews continued to live and practice their religion in Spain, as shameless as the whore of Babylon? Surely this newly unmasked crisis, this long-hidden atrocity of ubiquitous heresy amongst the Spanish people, surely that required the Catholic monarchs to make good on their promise to turn the land of convivencia into a truly Christian kingdom. In 1480, the same year the Inquisition was actually set up, a new strict set of policies required the segregation of Jewish populations into ghettos, both to separate them from conversos and also to create what we nowadays would call a hostile environment in order to encourage conversions. But it turned out it wasn't enough. The trigger for this was the final victory in 1492 over the Emirate of Granada, the last Muslim-ruled territory in Western Europe, which brought the whole peninsula finally under Christian rule. 2 months later, in the Alhambra Decree, a decree of 31st of March 1492, issued from the capital of Old Granada, drafted by Grand Inquisitor Torquemada, the remaining Jews of Castile and Aragon were given 4 months, either to convert to Christianity, and so placing themselves under the Inquisition's authority, or to leave. Some Spanish Jews hoped that, like so often before, this was a negotiating ploy, not a final demand. There's even a story that one Jewish scholar and financier who had lent King Ferdinand a good deal of money offered the king 30,000 ducats to revoke the decree, whereupon Torquemada threw a crucifix at the king's feet, saying, "Judas sold our Lord for 30 pieces of silver. His Majesty is about to sell him again for 30,000. It soon became clear that there was going to be no negotiation. Jews who chose to leave were permitted to sell their property and take their proceeds, but they weren't allowed to take actual coin, only bills of exchange. Plainly enough, anyone who chose this route was only going to be able to realize at best a fraction of the value of their possessions. And naturally, of course, the monarchs and their allies benefited handsomely from this. Again, exact figures are difficult. The majority of the remaining Jews in Spain converted, maybe 200,000 people. And since they had been given a choice, miserable one maybe, but a choice, in the eyes of the canon lawyers, these weren't forced conversions. And of course, instead of solving Spain's converso problem, this new wave of unwilling converts ensured that it was going to fester away for centuries, to be joined soon enough by a similar group of moriscos, that is, coerced converts from Islam, and their descendants. This famous early 17th century drawing shows a group of them being shipped off. The Inquisition remained in existence until 1834. But after 1530, it never operated on the mass scale of its first decades. It remained a live threat. Most famously, it arrested Bartolomé Carranza, the Archbishop of Toledo, primate of Spain, in 1558, and held him on suspicion of heresy for 18 years. Finally declared him not to have been a heretic after all, but required him to renounce a series of errors and sentenced him to house arrest in a Dominican friary, where he died a week later. As late as 1826, the Inquisition put a schoolteacher to death for his anti-Christian views. But it's worth emphasizing that after its initial blood-soaked years, it was more an ever-present latent threat than a kind of religious Gestapo. It did use torture, but much less than most other legal systems of the age, chiefly because its procedures emphasized that torture usually produces false or misleading evidence. Probably fewer than 10% of trials involved the use of torture. Or again, if you were to be accused of witchcraft in 16th century Europe and you could choose where to be tried, you would be well advised to be tried before the Spanish Inquisition. The tribunal was generally highly skeptical of witchcraft accusations, seeing them as superstitious. You could reasonably expect the case to be dismissed. The best estimate is that from around 1540 onwards, the Inquisition executed a little less than 1,000 people. Most of them before 1750, and the largest number being conversos from Portugal, which fell under Spanish rule between 1580 and 1640. Now, I mean, this is obviously bad, but by modern standards of mass killing, it hardly registers. So how is it that the Spanish Inquisition came to have the reputation that it does? It's no surprise that 19th century liberals like Goya should have chosen it as a symbol of the old order that they're trying to overthrow. maybe no surprise either that General Franco should have at least toyed with the idea of restoring it in the 1930s. But the Spanish Inquisition's reputation is international. In Voltaire's Candide, it became what it's remained ever since, a handy symbol of faceless tyranny, arbitrary justice, and bureaucratic malice from which escape is impossible, and for whom concepts like law or even guilt and innocence have no meaning. If you dig into what we mean by words like Kafkaesque or Orwellian, pretty soon you find an image of the Spanish Inquisition. When Dostoevsky wanted a symbolic figure of religious cruelty for the parable he told in The Brothers Karamazov, he chose to set his story in 16th century Seville and to make his villain the Grand Inquisitor. Dostoevsky's American contemporary Edgar Allan Poe's short story The Pit and the Pendulum from 1842, a story which, to put it politely, makes little attempt at historical accuracy, is nevertheless firmly located in the Inquisition's dungeons in Toledo in 1808. The 1961 horror film, rather loosely based on Poe's story, relocated the story to 16th century Spain, virtually its only concession to plausibility. Mel Brooks's Torquemada sketch in his 1981 film The History of the World Part 1 plays with this story the way that only a Jewish comedian unfettered by constraints like good taste could. To say nothing of Monty Python, whose Spanish Inquisition sketch has become so famous that it's produced that ultimate marker of modern cultural significance, a Lego set. I think the scroll on the right is particularly ingenious. And we can trace this reputation back to the age of the Inquisition itself, but maybe not quite to its heyday. To take another modern example, in Robert Bolt's play and film A Man for All Seasons, set in England in the years around 1530, first the naive Duke of Norfolk and then the sinister Thomas Cromwell say, "This isn't Spain, this is England," by which they mean this is a country of laws and not of arbitrary arrest and execution. The trouble is, nobody in 1530s England was actually using Spain as a symbol of things like that. The first real glimpse that the outside world had of the Spanish Inquisition came in 1567 with the publication of this book, first published in Latin, that's the version on the left, and then the English translation the following year. Written by a Spanish Protestant, which is quite a rare bird, under the name of Reginaldo de Montes. First published in Heidelberg, then translated in Latin, then translated into French, Dutch, and English. Two things to notice about this book. One, the vivid illustration that it was published with, laying out the cruelties of the Inquisition for all to see, the entire scheme. Notice in particular the four corners, each one of which demonstrates one of the different methods of torture used by the Inquisition. You get the idea. And then notice in the center, you've got the public element as well as the private. The torture, of course, taking place behind closed doors. But here we have the victims being brought to be condemned, being paraded before the population on the scaffold on the left there, and then those sentenced to be burned in the middle, with the prince's chair overseeing it all, although the prince himself is too bored by such a routine event to bother actually turning up. And alongside this, notice the focus of its narrative. Montes' book gives us a great deal about inquisitorial procedures and their desperate injustice, but it doesn't have very much to say about the conversos, or the thousands of Jewish victims of the Inquisition. It concentrates on a more recent episode, the Inquisition's sudden discovery of what it took to be a nest of Protestants in Seville in 1557-58, a discovery which alarmed Spanish officials, including the recently abdicated King and Emperor Charles V, who was horrified to see that the heresies that had torn his German realms apart were now appearing in Spain. Fearing that it was the beginning of something, the Inquisition was let loose, resulting in a series of arrests and trials in 1559. First in Valladolid, where 1 unrepentant and 13 penitent heretics were executed, 16 more escaped with lesser penalties. A second round in the same city saw 12 executions, 4 of them of nuns. There were 2 rounds of burnings in Seville in 1559 and 1560, 18 and 14 people executed respectively. A final 18 executions followed in 1562. So that's 76 in total. That's a hefty body count for what had been a rather minor outbreak of heresy. It certainly demonstrated both the ferocity of the Inquisition's methods and the determination with which it would stamp out any whisper of dissidence. The Inquisitors would argue, though, that this decisive action spared Spain the catastrophic religious wars that convulsed much of the rest of the continent. You don't need to approve of the Inquisition to accept that they might have had a point. If there could ever have been a Spanish Reformation, this surge of persecution swept it away. But for the rest of Europe, and especially for the Protestant half of the continent, these dozens of killings put the Spanish Inquisition on the map in the way that thousands of dead Jews had not. Mass burnings of Jews were not an atrocity, in the sense that nobody found them particularly useful as propaganda. Much smaller scale killings of Protestants definitely were. It particularly helped that amongst those killed in Seville were 2 English sailors who'd become involved in heretical groups there. Montes' account wasn't inaccurate. In particular, his description of the Inquisition's legal procedures is pretty straight. Sometimes atrocities don't need an embellishment. But there were certainly distortions and exaggerations. There are stories woven in which are, well, let's say, unsupported by independent evidence, and which don't seem to have lost anything in the telling, like the claim that at one of the executions, a victim cried out to King Philip II, who was there in person, for mercy, and Philip supposedly told the man that if his own son had fallen into such heresies, he himself would carry the wood with which to burn him. More substantially, Montes and the other accounts that followed him made a great deal out of the Inquisition's use of torture. They described it as universal, not exceptional. Some of the writing about this is prurient to the point of sadism. And another theme that was emphasized is the supposed corruption of the Inquisitors, accused of exploiting their powers for financial gain, of merchants having their goods seized on flimsy pretexts, including one story, believe this or not, as you like, it comes from Sir Walter Raleigh, which isn't the most rock-solid pedigree. Story of a Flemish merchant who was suspected of heresy and protested that he was a good Catholic. The Inquisitors could find no evidence to the contrary, so that they admitted, while he himself was a faithful son of the church, his goods were heretical and therefore had to be confiscated. That's only one of a wider vein of merry tales of entrapment and cunning webs woven around innocents by inquisitors, like the maker of religious statues who refuses to sell one to an undercover inquisitor at a knockdown price, saying that he would rather smash it than undervalue his own work like that, only to find himself arrested for iconoclasm. And so, as these stories are told and retold, republished and embellished, a myth was born. The story known to modern scholars as the Leyenda Negra, the Black Legend of the Spanish, as a uniquely cruel, subtle, and tyrannical people. This is how, during the invasion scare of the Spanish Armada in 1588, so many English people became convinced that every Spanish ship carried an inquisitor armed with portable instruments of torture. How by the 1650s, that had grown into a fact, so widely known as to be indisputable, that if the Spanish Armada had landed, they would have killed every English person over the age of 7 and sentenced the children to perpetual slavery. In other words, the atrocity stories of the Inquisition did what a really good atrocity story always does. They made anything believable by almost literally demonizing their subjects. And while I think we in this country no longer regard the Spanish as a uniquely cruel and inhuman nation, the Black Legend is not dead, and the Spanish Inquisition is not just a metaphor. The wave of international romantic support for Spanish Republicans in the Civil War in the 1930s was buoyed by a residual sense of what Spanish tyranny might mean. And in the United States, the war fought against Spain in the 1890s, the continued deep reluctance to accept Hispanic populations as properly American, the distinction generally made between white and Hispanic Americans as different categories, which looks very peculiar from the outside. This continues to reflect a deep residual sense of Hispanics as a people ill-suited to freedom and given to cruelty, a sense that they are inhuman, maybe even a little subhuman. That partly draws on another deep seam of atrocity stories relating to Spanish conquest and colonization of the Americas. That's too big a theme to talk about today, though we'll be noticing it in future lectures. But it also reflects another deeper theme, that the Spanish did these things, and maybe still do them, because they're Catholics, and because Catholicism was, and therefore deep down still is, a religion of cruelty and of tyranny. In the next lecture, we're going to return to that myth and to see how it came to be woven into the English-speaking world. Thank you.